There are 4 slides for social cognition in which we will cover person perception, attribution, the self as a social object, and attitudes. Social cognition, it's an area of social psychology that explores how people select, interpret, remember, and use social information. Basically, how do people think in social situations? This first slide in this section is over person perception. So this is the process where we use social stimuli to form impressions about others. For example, another person's face is a social stimuli, and we make judgments about that face knowingly, but we also a lot of times will make judgments about that face unknowingly as well. As an example, some social psychologists ask people to rate the competence and trustworthiness of individuals from photographs just of their faces. Now, these faces were candidates in political elections, and just based off of those pictures, the respondents were able to predict the outcome of those elections about 70% of the time. So it's big. Just from a picture of a face. It's profound how much stock we put into something superficial like that without even being aware of it. Related to this is the study of physical attractiveness. Infants as young as 3 months old show a preference for attractive faces versus unattractive faces. Attractive people are assumed to have a variety of other positive characteristics, such as their being friendly, better job performance, more likable. And so these ideas, when you take it all together, they're related to this stereotype that beautiful is good. So, what's a stereotype? Stereotypes are essentially mental shortcuts, a shortcut to avoid thinking deeply about that individual. It's a generalization about a group's characteristics that does not consider any variations among individuals. It's basically a way to preserve cognitive resources. You make generalizations because you want to sort people quickly without spending a lot of time thinking about them as an individual, because there's a term for this where we are cognitive misers. Back to that stereotype that beautiful is good. Is it true that beautiful people possess a bunch of other good qualities? Not necessarily, but a self-fulfilling prophecy can sometimes occur. If there is an expectation that an individual is supposed to be nice, they might actually start to do things to make that expectation come true. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a classic example of this from the 1960s. Researchers told grade school teachers that they had some students that were going to be late bloomers and that eventually their abilities were going to shine through. At the end of the semester, those students that the researchers said were late bloomers actually had better grades. The thing was, though, that those students were randomly selected by the researchers, so they weren't necessarily late bloomers. But by placing that thought in the teacher's head that they were going to be late bloomers, they changed the interaction between the teacher and the student, causing what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Somewhat related to this idea is the idea that beauty is actually average. So when we think of someone like Ryan Gosling, we think of them as being very unique, but some research has disagreed with that and says that he's actually very average. What researchers did was they created faces by averaging the faces 8, 16, or 32 faces together into one face. Then they had the participants rate individual faces and the morph faces on how attractive they were. The faces that had been averaged were considered more attractive than the individual faces, suggesting that average is what we actually think of as attractive. Clearly, Gosling, very average. Related to this are first impressions. Research has shown that people need just 100 millisecond exposure to form an impression of someone. What's interesting is that these first impressions are actually sometimes fairly accurate. So based on brief exposure to another person, an individual was able to tell if a person was romantically interested in them, if they had a propensity for violence, and even their sexual orientation, just from a snap exposure to that person. So, with person perception, we make super quick judgments about people to save cognitive resources. Sometimes first impressions are accurate, and your impressions of someone else can create a self-fulfilling prophecy for that person. On the next slide, we will cover attributions.